The words still echo in my mind. Piercing, cruel, deliberate. After Saturday, don't expect to be part of our lives anymore. That's what my son's bride-to-be said to me the evening before their ceremony. Her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through every hope I'd been holding onto. I didn't attend the wedding the next morning. Stayed right here in this house, shattered and empty. But by early afternoon, everything had collapsed, the entire celebration torn apart at the seams. And when the truth finally surfaced, no one could believe what had been hiding beneath all that white lace and champagne. The Friday before my son's wedding, I genuinely believed I was standing at the threshold of his greatest joy, and perhaps the most meaningful validation of my own journey. You see, I'd raised him by myself for 28 years, navigating sacrifices that existed only in the private spaces of my memory. I turned down career advancements that would have required relocating, canceled trips I'd dreamed about since I was young, and became an expert at making $15 feed us for 3 days. All so my boy, my Thomas, would never have to carry the burden of what we lost when his father disappeared from our lives. To me, his wedding represented far more than just him marrying the woman he claimed to love. It stood as living proof that despite everything, despite the poverty and the loneliness and the endless exhaustion, I had somehow managed to raise a decent human being. That's what I kept telling myself anyway, trying to believe it even when doubt crept in during the quiet hours. That particular evening, I drove over to the rehearsal venue carrying something I'd been crafting for nearly 2 months, a memory album documenting Thomas's journey from his first wobbly steps to his college graduation ceremony. From bandaged knees to the afternoon, he received his acceptance letter from medical school. I'd poured everything I had into those pages, desperately wanting his soon-to-be wife, Lauren, to understand the depth of love and sacrifice that had shaped the man she was preparing to stand beside. Lauren greeted me at the entrance, looking flawless as she always did. Impeccable hair, designer dress, practiced smile. But something in her expression that night carried an iciness I'd never witnessed before. Something that made my stomach tighten even before she spoke. "Lauren," I said, extending the album toward her, "I put this together for Thomas. I thought maybe you could look through it together tonight, before tomorrow." She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a level that ensured no one else would overhear our conversation. "After Saturday," she murmured, her lips curving into the faintest suggestion of a smirk. "Don't expect to be part of our lives anymore." The statement hit me with the force of a physical blow. I blinked rapidly, convinced I must have misunderstood her. "I'm sorry, what did you—" "You heard me perfectly," she interrupted, still whispering. "You've fulfilled your purpose. You raised Thomas. Tomorrow he becomes my husband, my responsibility, my future. And you're simply dead weight now. Don't humiliate yourself by trying to hold on." I stood there frozen, gripping that album like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. My throat constricted, burning, but I couldn't force out a single sound. She tilted her head slightly, seemingly entertained by my speechlessness. "Honestly, I've been patient with you for far too long. Thomas loves you, naturally. But affection makes people foolish, clouds their judgment. I see you clearly, though. See you for exactly what you are. Someone who has no place in the life we're building. So do both of us a favor. Don't show up tomorrow. Save everyone the awkwardness." I should have responded. I should have defended myself, defended the years of devotion and struggle and unconditional love. Instead, I felt crushed under the accumulated weight of decades. Decades of solitude, of working overnight shifts, of pretending I wasn't completely depleted just so Thomas wouldn't see how difficult our life had become after his father abandoned us. And now this woman, the one who supposedly loved him enough to marry him, was informing me I was expendable, disposable, irrelevant. She patted my arm with false sympathy, like consoling a confused child. "Go home, Mrs. Patterson. Sleep late. Tomorrow will be the most beautiful day of our lives. And frankly, we don't need you there casting shadows over it." I don't remember walking back to my car. I don't remember the drive home through streets I'd traveled thousands of times. What I do remember with crystalline clarity is sitting on the edge of my bed later that night, staring down at Thomas's memory album, my hands trembling so violently the pages nearly tore under my grip. Every photograph captured a moment of love, of sacrifice, of refusing to give up even when everything felt impossible. And yet tomorrow I was expected to act as though none of it mattered, as though I didn't matter. Tears blurred my vision. But underneath the devastating heartbreak, something else began to stir. A cold, quiet fury. I whispered into the darkness of my bedroom. If I'm not going to be part of their lives after tomorrow, then tomorrow I simply won't be there at all. So the next morning, Saturday morning, I remained home. I assumed the wedding would proceed without me, that Thomas would marry her and I'd be erased from my own son's story, quietly edited out like an embarrassing mistake. But by early afternoon that day, the entire community was talking. The wedding had never taken place, and the reason behind its collapse would alter everything we thought we understood. I suppose to anyone observing from a distance, I appeared to be just another suffocating mother unable to release her grip. That's the narrative Lauren had carefully constructed around me over the past few years, painting me as possessive and interfering. But the reality is I never clung to Thomas. I held him upright because there was no one else who would. When Thomas's father left us, he didn't just abandon me. He abandoned his child. I'll never forget that specific night. Thomas was only 6 years old, clutching his stuffed elephant in one small hand, and asking me, "Mama, when is Daddy coming back home?" I had no answer for him. Only tears I desperately tried to hide behind manufactured smiles and false reassurances. From that moment forward, it was just the two of us against everything. I became the provider, the nurturer, the encourager, the disciplinarian, all of it. I worked double shifts at the hospital laundry facility, sometimes arriving home so exhausted I'd fall asleep still wearing my work clothes, my body too tired to even change. But every time Thomas brought home a perfect test score, every time he made me a lopsided birthday card with crayons and glitter, I knew the struggle was worthwhile. He developed into a young man who was compassionate, intelligent, driven. He studied with an intensity I'd rarely witnessed in anyone. He wanted to become a doctor, not for the prestige or the salary, but because he once told me, "Mom, I want to help people who are suffering, the way you always helped me when things were hard." That single sentence sustained me through countless sleepless nights, through moments when I wasn't sure we'd make it through another month. So when he brought Lauren home to meet me for the first time 3.5 years ago, I genuinely truly wanted to welcome her into our small family. She was stunning, confident, polished, the type of woman who seemed to command attention the moment she entered a space. Thomas was completely captivated, and I wanted nothing more than his happiness. But beneath the polished exterior, I began noticing small fractures in her facade. She maintained perfect politeness toward me whenever Thomas was present, but the instant he stepped away, her tone would shift, becoming sharp, dismissive, as if speaking to me was an obligation she resented. She never asked about my life, my work, or even stories from Thomas's childhood. Instead, she dominated conversations with discussions about herself, her career in pharmaceutical sales, her influential social circle, her elaborate future plans. Initially, I dismissed these observations. Perhaps she was nervous, uncertain how to connect with me, but as months passed, those fractures widened into obvious cracks. On Thomas's birthday last year, I baked his favorite cake, dark chocolate with salted caramel frosting, a tradition we'd maintained since he was 9 years old. When I brought it to his apartment, Lauren smiled sweetly and commented, "Oh, how nostalgic. But Thomas is following a strict nutrition plan now. I'll make sure this doesn't derail his progress." She took the knife from my hands and moved the cake aside, untouched and unwanted. Thomas laughed nervously, kissed my cheek, and said, "Thanks, Mom. You really didn't need to go to all this trouble." But I caught the flash of guilt in his eyes. He knew I'd stayed awake past midnight baking that cake, measuring ingredients we could barely afford. Still, I swallowed my hurt because that's what mothers do, isn't it? Every time Lauren dismissed me, every time she undermined my presence, I convinced myself it didn't truly matter. She loved Thomas. That had to be enough. Or so I desperately tried to believe. The engagement should have represented my opportunity to finally gain a daughter, not lose a son. Instead, it only expanded the distance growing between us. Lauren assumed complete control over every wedding detail. I wasn't invited to a single dress fitting, not one cake tasting, not even the discussion about seating arrangements. When I gently suggested I might help with something, anything, she offered me a tight, condescending smile and said, "Don't worry yourself, Mrs. Patterson. We have everything managed. You just need to show up looking presentable. All right?" It stung deeply, but I smiled, nodded, and swallowed my disappointment, all for Thomas's sake. Because that's what I'd always done, hadn't I? But there were warning signs I should never have ignored. Like how Lauren always seemed more fascinated by Thomas's earning potential than his actual dreams and aspirations. The way she'd roll her eyes when he mentioned wanting to work in underserved communities. The way she introduced him at social gatherings. Not as my fiancé Thomas, but as Thomas, who's about to complete his medical residency. Looking back now with painful clarity, I realize she never saw my son as a complete human being. She saw him as an acquisition, a strategic investment. And that Friday night before the wedding, when she finally released those venomous words directly into my face, every tiny warning sign I'd been ignoring for years suddenly crystallized into horrifying sense. I wasn't losing my son to genuine love. I was losing him to calculated ambition, to greed disguised as affection, to someone who viewed me, his mother, as an inconvenient obstacle that needed to be removed from her perfect picture. And I let her. I actually allowed it to happen, at least until Saturday morning when fate intervened in ways none of us could have possibly anticipated. The morning of the wedding, I woke before dawn. For a brief moment, my body moved automatically, reflexively, boiling water for tea, laying out the pale lavender dress I'd purchased months earlier, the one Thomas had commented on, saying, "Mom, that color really suits you beautifully." But then Lauren's words returned, crashing through my mind like waves of ice water. After Saturday, don't expect to be part of our lives anymore. I sat at my small kitchen table, watching steam rise from my cup, my hands shaking, not from age, but from the crushing weight of a decision I already knew I'd made. I wasn't going. For the first time in 28 years, I was choosing my own dignity over Thomas's expectations. Perhaps it was selfish. Perhaps it was cowardly. But I couldn't force myself to sit in that church, smiling politely while watching him pledge his life to a woman who had already erased me from their future. I placed the memory album back into its box and slid it beneath my bed. He wouldn't see it today. Perhaps he'd never see it at all. As morning light gradually filled my kitchen, my phone started buzzing insistently. Messages from relatives, friends, even Thomas himself. "Mom, we're heading to the church now. Can't wait to see you there. Where are you?" People are starting to ask, "You're running behind schedule, aren't you?" "That's so typical of you." I turned the phone face down on the table. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that I was making a terrible mistake. But louder still was the echo of Lauren's smirk, her dismissive certainty that I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed and then discarded. If that's truly what she wanted, then I'd give it to her. By 9 o'clock, the calls became increasingly frantic. Thomas left a voicemail, his voice edged with rising panic. "Mom, where are you? Lauren mentioned you weren't feeling well last night, but I know that's not true. Please, just call me back. Please, Mom. I need you there." I pressed the phone against my chest, my heart fracturing with every word. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to call him immediately, to rush to the church, to be present for the boy I'd raised through every imaginable storm. But I couldn't. Not this time. Not after what Lauren had said, what she'd made abundantly clear. At 10 o'clock, my sister knocked urgently on my front door. She lived on the other side of town, but had driven over, still wearing her bridesmaid dress when she realized I wasn't at the venue. "Margaret, what on earth are you doing?" she demanded, pushing past me into my house. "Everyone's searching for you." "The ceremony begins in less than an hour." I shook my head slowly, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm not going, Claire." Her jaw literally dropped open. "Not going. Are you losing your mind? Your only son is getting married today." I finally looked up at her, tears flooding my eyes. "He's marrying someone who told me directly to my face that I'm not part of his life anymore, that she doesn't want me there, so why should I go? Why should I sit there pretending I belong when she's made it clear I don't?" My sister's anger faltered instantly, replaced by complete disbelief. "Lauren said that? She actually said those words to you? Last night. Looked me straight in the eyes and said exactly that?" Claire sank slowly into a chair. Momentarily speechless, for a long stretch the only sound was the steady ticking of my wall clock. Finally she whispered, "Oh my God, Margaret." I nodded, tears now streaming freely down my face. "I won't sit there like a fool, pretending to be welcome when I'm clearly not. I won't do it, Claire." She pressed both hands over her mouth, torn visibly between anger on my behalf and pity for the impossible situation. "But Margaret," she finally said, "if you don't attend, people will blame you entirely. They'll say you abandoned Thomas on the most important day of his life. They'll make you the villain in this story." I released a bitter, hollow laugh. "Then let them. I've been judged my entire life, haven't I? What's one more round of judgment? At 11:15, I stood at my front window, watching neighbors climb into their cars, dressed in formal attire, heading toward the church. My own car keys sat untouched on the kitchen counter. I didn't move an inch. When the church bells began ringing at 11 o'clock, I sat in complete silence, staring at the memory album hidden beneath my bed. That should have been the conclusion of my story. A mother too wounded, too humiliated to stand beside her son on the most significant day of his life. But by noon, everything changed. The first call came through. It was Claire again, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Margaret," she whispered urgently. "The wedding? It's not happening." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean, it's not happening?" Her words tumbled out in a rush, half choked with disbelief. "Lauren, oh God, Margaret, you need to hear this. You need to sit down right now." And in that single moment, I realized something completely unexpected. By refusing to attend, I hadn't destroyed the wedding. Lauren had destroyed it herself. And the reason why would shake all of us to our very foundations. When Claire's trembling voice came through the phone line, I felt time itself seemed to stop. "The wedding isn't happening," she repeated, her words sharp with shock and confusion. "Lauren's been exposed, Margaret. Everything's fallen apart." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "What is what? What are you talking about?" "Exposed how?" "Margaret, this is complicated, but you need to hear it from me before it spreads everywhere, before the gossip takes over." Thomas discovered the truth just minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start. My knees gave out beneath me. I collapsed onto the couch, the room spinning slightly around me. "What truth, Claire?" "What did he discover?" She exhaled shakily, searching for the right words. "That Lauren's been lying about everything. About who she is, about what she wanted, about all of it. Later, as I pieced together the full story from frantic phone calls, text, messages, and news that spread through our community like wildfire, the sequence of events unfolded with the dramatic intensity of something you'd see in a movie. Except this was devastatingly real. At approximately 10:30 that morning, just 30 minutes before the scheduled ceremony, Thomas had been waiting in a small preparation room at the church, his nerves clearly visible. His groomsmen surrounded him, trying to lighten the mood with jokes, adjusting his tie, offering encouraging pats on the back and reassurances that everything would be perfect. But then Marcus, his best friend since childhood, burst through the door looking pale and shaken, his face drained of all color. "Thomas," Marcus said urgently, holding out his phone with a trembling hand. "You need to see this right now, man. You need to see this before you walk down that aisle." On the screen were photographs, multiple photographs. Lauren, his bride-to-be, wrapped intimately in another man's arms, kissing him, holding, looking at him, with an expression Thomas had thought was reserved only for him. The images weren't old faded memories from some distant past. They were recent, crystal clear, time-stamped from just 3 weeks ago. Thomas's face drained of all color instantly. What is this? Where did these come from?" "Her downstairs neighbor sent them to me," Marcus explained, his own voice breaking slightly. "He's been suspicious for weeks. Saw them together multiple times. He thought you deserved to know the truth. before you made what could be the biggest mistake of your entire life. The man in the photographs wasn't some random stranger. He was Lauren's direct supervisor, the one she'd spoken about constantly and enthusiastically, always claiming he was simply her professional mentor, nothing more. Thomas staggered backward, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. In that single crushing moment, the truth he'd been unconsciously refusing to acknowledge came crashing down around him with brutal force. The late nights, supposedly working on important projects. The secretive text messages she'd always angle her phone away from. The way Lauren would brush off his gentle concerns with a dismissive laugh and a quick kiss, assuring him he was being paranoid. It had all been true. Every suspicion, every nagging doubt. She had been unfaithful to him, betraying him while simultaneously planning their future together. But the affair wasn't even the complete story, wasn't the full extent of the deception. As wedding guests began filing into the church, murmuring among themselves and checking the time, whispers started spreading like a contagious disease through the gathering crowd. Lauren's maid of honor, apparently drunk on a volatile mixture of nervousness and champagne consumed too early in the day, had accidentally let something crucial slip during a conversation near the refreshments table. Lauren hadn't merely been unfaithful to Thomas. She'd also been strategically scheming about their entire future together. Her family, it turned out, had actively pushed her toward this engagement specifically because Thomas was on the verge of completing his medical residency and entering what would likely be a highly lucrative career. To them, to her parents especially, this marriage wasn't about love or compatibility or building a life together. It was purely a financial transaction, a calculated merger of assets. The prenuptial agreement Lauren had insisted they needed to draft, claiming it was to protect both of them equally, wasn't designed to protect Thomas at all. It had been carefully constructed to systematically funnel his future earnings, his hard-earned income, directly into accounts controlled by her family. Her father, a businessman with a documented history of failed ventures, mounting debts, had even bragged openly to another guest earlier that morning, apparently feeling confident and celebratory. Once Lauren marries that doctor, all our financial troubles will finally disappear. We'll be set for life. By the time Thomas stormed into the bridal preparation suite, he was shaking visibly with a combination of rage, betrayal, and heartbreak. Lauren, absolutely radiant in her elaborate wedding gown, turned toward him with a brilliant smile. "Sweetheart," she said brightly, "are you ready? It's almost time." He held up Marcus's phone. The damning photographs displayed clearly on the screen. "What the hell is this, Lauren? What the hell have you been doing?" Her confident expression faltered immediately, for perhaps the first time since I'd known her. The carefully maintained mask slipped completely. That's not what it looks like," she began, her voice losing its usual assurance. "It's exactly what it looks like," Thomas roared, his voice cracking with emotion. 3 weeks ago, with your boss. The one you kept telling me was just a mentor, just a colleague." Her bridesmaids gasped collectively, hands flying to their mouths. The room fell into shocked silence. Lauren's voice turned sharp, defensive. "Thomas, listen to me carefully. You need to let me explain this. No, you listen." His voice broke completely. "You told my mother she wasn't part of this family anymore. You deliberately tried to cut out the one person who's always been there for me, who sacrificed everything for me. And this entire time, you were lying straight to my face about everything. Jessica's cheeks flushed deep red with fury rather than embarrassment. Your mother? Is that what this is really about? She's been poisoning your mind against me from the very beginning, Thomas. She's jealous. Can't you see that? She doesn't want to let you go. Doesn't want you to have your own life. But the accusation fell completely flat because in that crystallizing moment, Thomas finally understood the truth with perfect clarity. I hadn't needed to poison him against her. She had poisoned herself through her own actions, her own choices, her own cruel words and calculated deceptions. By 11:15, the church had descended into absolute chaos. Guests whispered frantically to one another, gasped at the unfolding drama, checked their phones as the shocking news rippled outward through the assembled crowd. The pastor attempted desperately to restore some semblance of order, but Thomas walked deliberately down the center aisle, not accompanied by a bride, but carrying a grim announcement that would echo through everyone's memory. "There will be no wedding today," he said, his voice shaking but remarkably firm given the circumstances. "Lauren has betrayed my trust completely. This ceremony is canceled, effective immediately." Audible gasps filled the church sanctuary. Lauren's parents shot to their feet in immediate protest, her mother actually screeching, "Don't you dare humiliate our daughter like this in front of everyone. Don't you dare destroy everything we've planned." But Thomas didn't flinch, didn't waver. She humiliated herself through her own choices. "I'm simply telling the truth." Lauren, now furious beyond measure, chased after him down the aisle, screaming about misunderstandings and lies and taking things out of context. But the photographs didn't lie. Neither did the whispered confessions about her family's ulterior financial motives. By noon, the guests were filing out of the church in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some muttered about wasted money and ruined plans and the awkwardness of it all. Others whispered with sympathy specifically for me, though I hadn't even been present to witness any of it. When Claire finished relaying the complete story over the phone, I sat frozen in my living room, the phone still pressed against my ear. My heart ached profoundly for Thomas, for the heartbreak he absolutely didn't deserve, for the betrayal he'd have to process and somehow move beyond. But beneath the maternal sorrow, another feeling bloomed unexpectedly within me. Vindication. A sense of being proven right, even though I'd never wanted to be. Lauren had told me with such confidence and cruelty that I wasn't part of the family anymore. And now there was no family for her to claim, no future for her to control, no carefully constructed plan for her to execute. I whispered into the phone, almost to myself, my voice barely audible. She wanted me gone from their lives. But she's the one who's gone now. She destroyed everything herself. That should have been the conclusion of Lauren's presence in our lives, the final chapter of her involvement with Thomas. But it wasn't, because when people like her lose everything they've been scheming toward, they don't simply accept defeat and disappear quietly. And I was about to discover exactly how far she and her desperate family were willing to go to try to claw back what they believed was rightfully theirs. For the remainder of that Saturday, and all through Sunday, my phone never stopped buzzing. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months, neighbors I barely knew, even distant relatives I'd almost forgotten existed. All calling, texting, sending links to social media posts that were spreading with alarming speed. The canceled wedding had become the talk of the entire community, the scandal everyone was discussing and dissecting. One online headline read, "Medical resident calls off wedding moments before ceremony after fiancé's affair, exposed through photographs." But another post, far more venomous and calculated, immediately caught my attention and made my stomach drop. Controlling mother-in-law sabotages son's wedding, tears young couple apart. Lauren's family was already actively rewriting the narrative, reshaping the story to suit their purposes. By Sunday evening, whispers had spread systematically that I was somehow the real reason the wedding had never happened, that I'd been feeding Thomas lies and manipulations about Lauren for months, that I had deliberately convinced him not to proceed with the marriage because of my own selfish needs. It was completely absurd, utterly disconnected from reality. Thomas had seen the photographs with his own eyes, had heard the financial scheming with his own ears. But lies travel infinitely faster than truth, especially when they're being spread by people who understand how to manipulate public perception. And Lauren's parents were absolute masters of performance and presentation. At one point, Lauren herself posted on social media, sharing a photograph of herself still in her ruined wedding dress, mascara streaking dramatically down her cheeks, with a caption that read, "Some people just can't let go. Some mothers never learn when to stop interfering." The comments flooded in almost immediately. Complete strangers offering their sympathy and support. Friends demanding to know what kind of mother would deliberately ruin her own son's happiness. People who knew nothing about the actual situation making harsh judgments based solely on Lauren's carefully crafted victimhood. I wanted to scream into the void of the internet. I wanted to shout the complete truth from every available platform. But Thomas begged me, desperately, not to engage with any of it. "Mom, please don't respond to any of this," he pleaded over the phone. "Don't lower yourself to her level. Everyone who actually matters to us, everyone who's close to us, knows exactly what really happened. But the painful problem was that not everyone close to us knew the truth." Some people actually believed Lauren's version of events. Some questioned me directly, their voices carrying doubt and judgment. Even people I'd known for years. People I'd considered friends. Asked with barely concealed suspicion, "Margaret, did you really tell Thomas not to marry her? Did you interfere?" It cut deeper than I could have anticipated. After everything I had sacrificed throughout my life, after everything Lauren had actually done, after her cruelty and her deception and her calculated manipulation, I was still somehow the villain in someone else's carefully constructed story. And then, just when I thought things couldn't possibly get worse, they did. 3 days after the canceled wedding, I received an official letter delivered by courier. A legal letter printed on expensive letterhead, filled with threatening language. Lauren's family was threatening to sue me. Sue me for defamation of character, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, even for something called tortious interference with contractual relations. I stared at the formal document, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Tortious interference with contractual relations. What did that even mean in this context? What contract had I supposedly interfered with? I brought the letter directly to my friend Janet, who worked as a paralegal at a law office downtown. She skimmed through it quickly, then shook her head with obvious disgust. "This is pure intimidation, Margaret. They're trying to frighten you into silence. Tortious interference with contractual relations is essentially a fancy legal way of claiming you deliberately ruined their financial plan, which, by the way, isn't even a legitimate legal argument in this particular situation. They don't have, case." "Financial plan?" I echoed, confused. "What financial plan are you talking about?" Janet set the threatening papers down on her desk carefully. "Margaret, didn't you know? Lauren's family is apparently drowning in debt, essentially bankrupt. Her father lost millions through a series of terrible investments over the past decade. They desperately needed her marriage to Thomas to stabilize their entire financial situation." She pulled up something on her computer, then turned the screen toward me. "That prenuptial agreement they drafted, it was specifically written to protect them, not Thomas. If he'd actually signed it, a significant percentage of everything he earned over the next 10 years would have been systematically transferred into accounts they controlled." My blood ran cold as the full picture finally came into sharp focus. So it had never been about love, not even for a single moment. It had always been about money, about control, about securing their financial future at Thomas's expense. And when I refused to attend the wedding, when my absence likely contributed to the chain of events that exposed everything, Lauren had seized the perfect opportunity to shift the entire narrative in her favor. She couldn't afford to be seen publicly as the greedy, unfaithful fiancé who'd been caught in her schemes, so instead she painted me as the bitter, controlling, jealous mother who couldn't let her son grow up and build his own life. It was strategically brilliant, in a cruel and calculating way. For the following week, the harassment continued relentlessly, escalating rather than diminishing. Anonymous messages flooded my email inbox and social media accounts. "Monster. Jealous old woman. You destroyed your own son's happiness. You should be ashamed of yourself." And Lauren's family wasn't finished with their campaign. One afternoon, I returned home from grocery shopping to find Thomas sitting on my couch, his face pale and drawn, holding yet another legal letter in his shaking hands. "They're threatening me now too, Mom," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "Lauren's father says, if I don't publicly clear her name, if I don't recant everything and claim it was all a misunderstanding, he'll drag you into court. He says he'll ruin you financially, destroy your reputation completely, make sure you lose everything." I sank slowly into the chair across from him, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. "What did you tell him?" Thomas's jaw tightened with visible anger. "I told him to go straight to hell," but I could clearly see the worry etched into every line of his face. He was fresh out of his residency, carrying massive student loans, his career just beginning to take shape. A lawsuit, even a completely frivolous one without merit, could drain his resources and damage his professional reputation before it even properly started. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I don't know how much more of this constant pressure I can take. They're absolutely relentless calling me, sending lawyers letters, posting things online. It never stops." I reached across the small space between us and took his hand firmly in mine. For so many years I had carried him through every imaginable storm. Now he was desperately trying to shield me from this one, trying to protect me the way I'd always protected him. But this wasn't a storm we could weather through silence and patience, and simply waiting for it to pass. No, this was war, and if Lauren and her family wanted war, then I would have to fight back with every weapon at my disposal. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, unable to sleep, I remembered something Lauren had said during one of her smug little speeches several months earlier, back when she'd felt completely secure in her control over the situation. "You don't really understand, Mrs. Patterson. In this world we live in, perception is absolutely everything. People believe what they see, what they're shown. Truth is almost irrelevant. She'd been right about that, at least. People believed her carefully crafted performance because she played the role of wounded victim so convincingly. Beautiful, heartbroken, innocent, the victim of a cruel and jealous mother-in-law who couldn't let go. If perception was her primary weapon, her tool of choice, then I would have to fight back with something stronger. Not quietly, not politely, not by hoping people would eventually see the truth on their own. I would fight back with documentation, with evidence, with the actual truth presented so clearly that even Lauren's manipulative skills couldn't obscure it. And I had exactly the ammunition I needed to do it, because Lauren's betrayal wasn't merely emotional and personal. Her family's schemes crossed legal and ethical lines. And once I properly exposed their financial manipulations, their predatory prenuptial agreement, their systematic planning to exploit Thomas, no amount of tears or social media posts would be able to save her reputation. I didn't fully know it yet, sitting there in my dark bedroom, but the next phase of this battle wouldn't be fought through whispers and gossip and carefully worded social media posts. It would be fought with documentation, with evidence, with legal exposure. And this time, after remaining silent for so long, after years of swallowing my hurt and biting my tongue, I absolutely would not stay quiet. For several weeks following the canceled wedding, Lauren's calculated smear campaign continued with relentless intensity. Her family pushed their carefully constructed narrative at every possible opportunity, through every available channel. I was the bitter, controlling mother who couldn't release her grip on her adult son. The jealous woman who had destroyed her own child's chance at happiness simply because she couldn't stand being replaced. It might have worked, might have succeeded in permanently destroying my reputation, if not for one critical factor that Lauren and her family hadn't properly accounted for. The truth, when properly documented and presented, has an extraordinary way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how much deception tries to bury it. I spent days systematically collecting everything I could find, every piece of evidence that might prove useful. Old email exchanges that Thomas had forwarded to me months ago when he'd been confused about certain things Lauren said. Screenshots of text message conversations he'd saved because something about them felt wrong. Copies of the prenuptial agreement Lauren's father had drafted, an agreement so laced with predatory clauses and one-sided terms that it read less like a marriage contract and more like a hostile business acquisition. Janet, my paralegal friend from the law office downtown, connected me with a financial investigator she knew, someone who specialized in uncovering hidden debts and fraudulent business practices. Within just 1 week of careful research, we uncovered exactly what Lauren's family had been desperately trying to hide from everyone, especially from Thomas. A documented string of bankruptcies stretching back nearly 15 years, massive debts to multiple creditors, lawsuits from former business partners claiming fraud and misrepresentation. A pattern of financial mismanagement so extensive and so severe that Lauren's father had apparently been barred from serving as an officer in several business organizations. They hadn't wanted Lauren to marry Thomas because of love, compatibility, or genuine affection. They had wanted his medical career, his future earning potential, his financial stability. And that prenuptial agreement had been their carefully designed golden ticket to accessing everything he would earn. Armed with all this documentation, with evidence I could actually prove rather than just assert, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. 3 weeks after the canceled wedding, Lauren's family organized what they called a reconciliation dinner at an expensive hotel ballroom downtown. They invited Thomas specifically, claiming they wanted to talk things over calmly, to resolve the unfortunate misunderstandings, to find a path forward for everyone involved. Thomas begged me not to attend. He was genuinely worried they might ambush me, attack me verbally or even physically, make the situation even worse than it already was. But I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't face them directly, if I didn't confront them with the evidence I'd gathered, they would never stop their campaign against me. They'd continue spreading lies, filing threatening legal papers, making my life and Thomas's life absolutely miserable. So I walked into that hotel ballroom Saturday evening, wearing the pale lavender dress I had originally bought for the wedding, the dress I'd never gotten the chance to wear. I wanted them to see it, to remember what they'd stolen from me, from Thomas, from all of us. Lauren's parents sat positioned at the head of an elaborately set table, Lauren seated beside them wearing a sleek black designer dress, her expression carefully arranged into something between wounded dignity and cold calculation. Several other family members filled additional seats, all watching me with varying degrees of hostility and suspicion. "Well," Lauren's father said with obviously forced pleasantness, "look who decided to grace us with her presence after all. Mrs. Patterson, we were just discussing how best to resolve this unfortunate situation, this misunderstanding that's caused so much unnecessary pain." "Misunderstanding?" I repeated calmly, my voice steadier than I actually felt inside. "Are you referring to the affair or the financial fraud?" Lauren's practiced smile faltered immediately. "You're still desperately clinging to those lies, those malicious—" I set a thick manila folder down on the table with deliberate force, the sound echoing slightly in the formal space. "Then perhaps you can explain these documents. Financial records documenting your family's bankruptcies, court filings from lawsuits your father lost. And this—" I pulled out a copy of the prenuptial agreement, this contract you drafted. Clause 17, subsection 4, to be specific. "In the event of divorce proceedings initiated within the first 7 years of marriage, 70% of Thomas Patterson's gross income shall be transferred into joint accounts held by Lauren Hayes and her father, Richard Hayes, for a minimum period of 5 years. Audible gasps rippled around the table. Even Thomas, who had skimmed through the prenuptial agreement, but admittedly never studied it in careful detail, turned noticeably pale. "You weren't just planning to marry him," I said, my voice cold and precise. "You were planning to systematically drain him financially. You wanted his future earnings to bail out your family's spectacular failures, to pay off your father's debts and failed investments." Lauren's father's face flushed deep crimson, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "You have absolutely no right to—" "I have every right," I interrupted him sharply. "Because you and your daughter dragged my name and my reputation through the mud publicly. You painted me as a jealous, vindictive woman who destroyed her own son's happiness. But now everyone here, everyone at this table, can see the actual truth. You weren't welcoming Thomas into your family. You were planning to exploit his bank account, his career, everything he'd worked so hard to build." Lauren's eyes narrowed dangerously, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely. "You wouldn't actually dare make any of this public. You wouldn't dare." Exposé. I leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze directly, my voice dropping to something quiet, but absolutely razor-sharp. Watch me. Watch me do exactly that. The confrontation spiraled rapidly into absolute chaos. Lauren desperately tried to insist the photographs of her affair were somehow manipulated or taken out of context. Her father threatened immediate lawsuits, his voice rising with each word. Her mother burst into theatrical tears about family unity and forgiveness and moving forward together. But Thomas didn't flinch this time, didn't waver or doubt himself. He stood up slowly, his voice trembling slightly but remarkably firm given the circumstances. "You lied to me about everything," he said, looking directly at Lauren. "You lied about loving me, about wanting to build a genuine life together. All you actually wanted was access to my money, to my career, to my future earnings. That's all I ever was to you. A financial opportunity." Lauren reached desperately for his hand, her voice suddenly soft and pleading, all the hardness gone in an instant. "Thomas, please. I made mistakes, yes, I admit that. But it was always you I wanted. It was always about you, not money, not—" He shook his head firmly, pulling his hand away from hers. "If that were even remotely true, you wouldn't have said what you said to my mother. You wouldn't have told her she wasn't part of my family, wasn't welcome in our lives. You wouldn't have deliberately tried to erase the person who sacrificed everything to raise me, who gave up her entire life so I could have opportunities." The room fell into heavy, uncomfortable silence. Lauren froze completely, finally realizing that her own cruel words, the words she'd whispered so confidently that Friday night, had come back to destroy her entirely. Her mask cracked completely then, desperation and panic spilling through the fractures. "She's the one turning you against me. Can't you see that? She's been manipulating you, poisoning your mind." "No," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You did that completely on your own. You destroyed everything through your own choices, your own actions, your own lies." That evening, I genuinely thought the confrontation would conclude with more shouting, with additional threats, with bitter accusations flying back and forth across that elaborately set table. But instead, it ended with Thomas walking steadily out of that hotel, his arm linked firmly through mine, his choice made absolutely clear. Lauren followed behind us desperately, her voice rising to near screaming, begging, sobbing, swearing frantically that nothing was how it appeared, that she could explain everything if he'd just listen. But for the first time in their entire relationship, Thomas didn't look back. He didn't pause. He didn't give her another chance to explain or manipulate or twist the truth into something more palatable. By the time we reached the parking lot, Thomas stopped walking and turned to face me directly. His eyes were red and swollen, his face pale with exhaustion and emotional devastation, but there was something new in his expression, too. A strength, a clarity, a determination that hadn't been there before. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, "I should have listened to you so much earlier. I should have seen what she really was." I pulled him into my arms, holding him exactly the way I had when he was a small child waking from nightmares, when the world felt too big and too frightening, and only his mother's embrace could make things feel safe again. "You see it now," I whispered against his shoulder. "You understand now. That's what truly matters. That's all that's important." But as we drove away from that hotel, as the lights faded behind us in the rear view mirror, Lauren's desperate words, echoed through my mind with crystal clarity. You wouldn't dare make this public. You wouldn't dare expose us. She'd been wrong about that, fundamentally wrong. Because if she genuinely wanted a war, fought through public perception and carefully managed narratives, then perception was exactly what she would get. And when the complete truth came out, when all the evidence was properly presented, her carefully constructed facade would crumble beyond any possibility of repair. In the days immediately following the hotel confrontation, Lauren and her family tried absolutely everything they could think of. Threats delivered through lawyers' letters filled with impressive-sounding legal language. Pleading phone calls at all hours. Desperate promises that they'd stop the harassment if we just agreed to sign non-disclosure agreements and never speak publicly about what had happened. Her father sent Thomas emails overflowing with complex legal terminology, insisting he was completely within his rights to pursue damages for breach of promise, for emotional distress, for reputational harm. Her mother left increasingly tearful voicemails begging Thomas to be reasonable, to show compassion, to remember that families should forgive each other. Lauren herself oscillated wildly between extreme rage and desperate manipulation. One moment she'd be sending threatening text messages swearing she'd ruin both of us completely, destroy our reputations so thoroughly we'd never recover. The next moment she'd be leaving whispered voicemails claiming she still loved Thomas deeply, that everything had been a terrible misunderstanding, that they could work through this together if he'd just give her one more chance. But it was already far too late for any of that. Because this time, the truth wasn't going to be confined to whispered conversations in a hotel ballroom, to private confrontations where only a few witnesses could hear what was actually said. This time, with Janet's invaluable help and guidance, I made sure everyone would know exactly what had happened. I provided copies of the prenuptial agreement and the detailed financial records to a journalist I'd been connected with. Someone who specialized in investigative reporting about financial exploitation and fraudulent schemes. Within just 1 week of careful fact-checking and verification, the article went live on a widely read news website. The headline read, "Behind the Canceled Wedding, the Hayes family financial schemes finally exposed." The article was absolutely damning in its thoroughness. It meticulously detailed the multiple bankruptcies spanning more than a decade. The predatory prenuptial agreement, designed to funnel a young doctor's earnings into debt-ridden family accounts. It even carefully hinted at the affair that had sparked the wedding day collapse, though it avoided using specific names to protect Thomas's privacy as much as possible. For the first time since this nightmare began, the wider world could see the complete story, not filtered through Lauren's tear-streaked social media posts and carefully crafted victim narrative, but presented through the cold, objective perspective of documented evidence, verified facts, undeniable proof. And almost immediately, the tide of public opinion turned dramatically. Comments flooded in beneath the article on social media, in community forums, not attacking me anymore, but finally directing their anger and disgust where it actually belonged. So she wanted his paycheck, not his heart. That's absolutely disgusting. That poor mother-in-law. Can you even imagine being told you're not family anymore after raising your son completely alone? Lauren's nothing but a calculated gold digger. That family should be ashamed. Those contract clauses are actually criminal. How did they think they'd get away with this? The sympathy and support that had been so cruelly denied to me for weeks suddenly poured in like warm sunlight breaking through storm clouds. People I'd known for years reached out to apologize for doubting me, for questioning my motives. for believing Lauren's lies without hearing my side of the story. Thomas, though still processing the profound heartbreak of betrayal, found new strength in seeing the truth finally acknowledged publicly. He threw himself completely into his new position at a hospital across town, determined to build a future on his own terms, free from Lauren's manipulation and her family's schemes. And for the first time in months, I watched him genuinely smile. Not the forced, nervous smile he'd worn throughout his relationship with Lauren, constantly trying to keep everyone happy and maintain an impossible peace. But his real smile, the one I remembered from his childhood, authentic and reaching all the way to his eyes. One warm evening several weeks later, as we sat together on my front porch drinking iced tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and residual pain. "I honestly don't know how you stayed so strong through all of this. She nearly broke me completely. The lies, the manipulation, the constant pressure. I don't know how you survived it." I looked at him carefully, at the man my little boy had become, forged through fire and hardship into someone stronger than he'd been before. "Because I've weathered worse storms than this," I answered honestly. "And because I knew, somewhere deep inside, that eventually you'd see her for exactly who she really was. It just required time and patience. And pain, unfortunately." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You were always my real family, Mom. Always. From the very beginning. Until right now. Sitting here together. That never changed. No matter what she said or tried to make me believe." Those words, simple and heartfelt, meant more to me than any public vindication, any article, any flood of supportive comments ever could. Because ultimately, that's what this entire battle had really been about. Not money or reputation or winning some kind of public relations war. It had been about protecting the bond between a mother and her son, about refusing to let someone cruel and manipulative sever a connection built over 28 years of unconditional love and sacrifice. And we had survived it, battered and bruised and emotionally exhausted, yes. But we had survived it together, and somehow that made both of us stronger than we'd been before. As the last light faded from the sky and evening settled around us, Thomas leaned his head against my shoulder the way he used to when he was small, and the world felt overwhelming. "I love you, Mom," he whispered into the gathering darkness. "I love you too, sweetheart," I whispered back, my heart finally beginning to heal. "I always have. I always will. That's what being family actually means." I wish I could say that the published article exposing Lauren's family schemes marked the definitive end of our ordeal, that justice had been served, and everyone simply moved forward with their lives. But reality, as I've learned repeatedly throughout my 53 years, rarely provides such clean, satisfying conclusions. The weeks following the article's publication brought their own unique challenges and complications, though thankfully of a very different nature than what we'd endured before. Lauren's family initially attempted to pursue legal action against both the journalist who'd written the exposé and against me personally for what they claimed was defamation and invasion of privacy. They hired an aggressive attorney who sent impressively official-looking letters threatening massive lawsuits, financial ruin, criminal charges for allegedly stealing confidential documents. But Janet, ever reliable and knowledgeable, connected us with a defense attorney who specialized in exactly these kinds of intimidation tactics. Within 2 days of reviewing the case, he determined that Lauren's family had absolutely no legal standing whatsoever. Everything published in that article was completely factual and properly documented, he explained, during our first meeting, his tone confident and reassuring. Bankruptcy filings are public records. The prenuptial agreement was legally obtained, since Thomas had every right to share his own contract. And truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. They're just desperate and flailing at this point. He drafted a response so legally ironclad, so thoroughly documented that Lauren's attorney withdrew from the case entirely within a week. Apparently, even he recognized they were pursuing something completely without merit. But while the legal threats evaporated relatively quickly, the social fallout continued rippling through our community for months afterward. Lauren's family, facing mounting public scrutiny and judgment, eventually left town entirely. I heard through various sources that they'd relocated somewhere south, trying to start fresh where their reputation hadn't been completely destroyed. Lauren herself disappeared from all social media, her carefully curated profiles going completely dark almost overnight. Some people criticized me for how publicly I'd handled everything, suggesting I should have taken the high road and dealt with matters privately. A few distant relatives actually stopped speaking to me entirely, claiming I'd been vindictive and cruel, that I'd taken things too far by involving journalists and making everything so dramatically public. But far more people, especially other mothers who'd watched their own children make questionable relationship choices, reached out with support and understanding. Women I barely knew would stop me at the grocery store or the pharmacy to share their own stories of difficult future in-laws, of watching helplessly as their children made choices that concerned them deeply. "You did what any mother would want to do," one woman told me, while we waited in line at the post office. "You protected your son when he couldn't protect himself. That takes real courage." Those moments of connection, of being truly seen and understood by people who recognized what I'd been fighting for, helped heal wounds I hadn't even fully acknowledged were there. Thomas struggled significantly during those months, processing not just the betrayal itself, but everything it represented about his judgment, his ability to see people clearly, his readiness for serious commitment. He threw himself into his work with almost frightening intensity, volunteering for extra shifts, taking on additional responsibilities, anything to keep his mind occupied and away from painful memories. I worried about him constantly, watching for signs that he was avoiding dealing with his emotions rather than processing them healthily. But gradually, slowly, I began seeing positive changes emerging from the wreckage of that relationship. He became more discerning about the people he allowed into his life, more willing to trust his instincts when something felt wrong, rather than dismissing his concerns. He reconnected with old friends he'd gradually drifted away from during his relationship with Lauren, friendships she'd subtly discouraged, because she'd wanted his attention focused primarily on her. And most importantly, his relationship with me deepened and strengthened in ways I'd never anticipated. We'd always been close out of necessity, bound together by circumstances and his father's absence. But now we chose that closeness, actively nurturing our connection, rather than simply accepting it as default. He started coming over for dinner every Sunday evening, a tradition we'd abandoned years earlier, when Lauren had begun monopolizing his weekends with social obligations and carefully planned activities. We'd cook together, usually his favorite meals from childhood that brought back happier, simpler memories. Spaghetti with my homemade sauce, pot roast with roasted vegetables, chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast dinner when we were feeling particularly nostalgic. During those quiet evenings together, We'd talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes we discussed the situation with Lauren, processing specific moments or conversations that still confused or hurt him. Other times we deliberately avoided the topic entirely, focusing instead on his work at the hospital, my volunteer activities at the community center, neighborhood gossip, plans for the future. One Sunday evening about 4 months after the canceled wedding, as we cleared dishes from dinner, Thomas brought up something that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Mom," he said carefully, drawing a plate with focused attention, "I've been thinking a lot lately about relationships, about how I completely missed all the warning signs with Lauren. And I keep wondering, did Dad show similar signs? Before he left, I mean? Were there things you ignored or explained away?" I paused with my hands in soapy dishwater, considering my response carefully. We rarely discussed his father, and Thomas almost never asked direct questions about that period of our lives. "Your father was different," I finally answered, choosing my words deliberately. "He wasn't cruel or calculating like Lauren. He was lost, I think. Overwhelmed by responsibility and expectations he'd never really wanted in the first place. When he left, it wasn't because he'd been planning some elaborate scheme or living a double life. He just gave up, decided he couldn't handle being a father and husband anymore." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. "Do you think that's worse or better? At least Lauren's betrayal was active, intentional. Dad just abandoned us. I don't know that worse or better really applies here," I said thoughtfully. "They were both profoundly hurtful in different ways. Your father's leaving destroyed one version of my life, forced me to rebuild everything from scratch. Lauren's betrayal attacked you during what should have been one of the happiest periods of your life. Different pain, different circumstances, but pain nonetheless." He set down the dish he'd been drying and turned to face me directly. "How did you know you were ready to trust someone again? After Dad left, after that kind of betrayal, how do you open yourself up to that possibility?" I smiled sadly, recognizing the real question beneath his words. He wasn't just asking about my experience. He was trying to understand his own path forward, how to eventually move beyond what Lauren had done without letting it poison every future relationship. "Honestly," I said, "I never really did trust that way again. I dated a bit over the years, but I always kept people at a certain distance, never let anyone get too close. I told myself it was about protecting you, making sure no unstable relationships disrupted your childhood. That was partly true, but it was also about protecting myself, avoiding the vulnerability that comes with truly opening your heart to someone." I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and met his concerned gaze directly. "But Thomas, sweetheart, I don't want that for you. Yes, Lauren hurt you terribly. Yes, she betrayed your trust in ways that will take time to fully heal from. But you're 28 years old. You have so much life ahead of you, so much capacity for love and joy and partnership. Don't let her steal that from you, too. Don't let her damage turn you into someone who can't trust, can't be vulnerable, can't open your heart." His eyes filled with tears that he blinked back quickly. "What if I make the same mistake again? What if I miss the warning signs again?" "Then you'll deal with it," I said firmly. "But Thomas, you won't miss them the same way. This experience, as painful as it's been, has taught you things about yourself and about other people that you couldn't have learned any other way. You'll be more cautious, yes, but hopefully also more aware, more willing to trust your instincts." He pulled me into a tight hug, and I felt some of the tension he'd been carrying for months finally begin to release. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, "for everything, for fighting for me even when I couldn't see what was happening, for not giving up." "Always," I whispered back. "That's what mothers do. We fight for our children, even when it's hard, even when they can't see why we're fighting." As spring gradually warmed into summer, life began settling into new rhythms and patterns. Thomas started dating someone new, a nurse named Sarah, who worked in a different department at his hospital. He approached this relationship with far more caution and awareness than he'd shown with Lauren, but also with a willingness to be open and vulnerable that made me hopeful for his future. When he eventually introduced her to me over coffee one Saturday morning, I watched their interaction carefully, looking for any red flags, any warning signs that might indicate problems ahead. But Sarah was genuinely lovely, warm without being performative about it, interested in Thomas's stories about his childhood without trying to compete with or diminish my role in his life. She asked thoughtful questions about my work and my interests, actually listening to my answers rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. As we said goodbye in the cafe parking lot, she surprised me by giving me a sincere hug. "Thank you for raising such a good man," she said quietly. "I know his path here wasn't easy, but the person he became through all of that is pretty extraordinary." Tears stung my eyes unexpectedly. After everything with Lauren, after being told I wasn't wanted in Thomas's future family, hearing those simple words of acknowledgement and respect meant more than Sarah could possibly know. "Thank you for seeing him clearly," I responded, my voice slightly unsteady. "For appreciating who he actually is." Driving home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just relief or vindication or even happiness exactly, but peace. A genuine sense that despite all the pain and struggle and heartbreak, things were finally moving in the right direction. That evening, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Mrs. Patterson?" An uncertain voice asked. "This is Amanda Hayes, Lauren's younger sister." My entire body tensed immediately. "What do you want, Amanda? Please, just listen for a moment," she said quickly, as if afraid I'd hang up before she could finish. "I'm not calling to defend Lauren or my parents. I'm calling to apologize." I sat down slowly on my couch, completely unprepared for this conversation. "I knew," Amanda continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I knew what they were planning with that prenuptial agreement. I knew about the affair, or at least suspected something was wrong. And I said nothing. I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that it was none of my business. But I was wrong, Mrs. Patterson. I should have warned Thomas, should have done something to stop it before everything exploded the way it did." For a long moment, I couldn't find words to respond. Of all the things I might have anticipated, this genuine apology from Lauren's own family member hadn't even crossed my mind. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. "Because I've been carrying this guilt for months," she said simply. "And because you deserve to know that not everyone in my family supported what they did. My parents have always been difficult, manipulative, willing to use people to solve their financial problems. I've tried to distance myself from them for years, but Lauren was my sister. I kept hoping she'd be different, that she'd make better choices. But she didn't. Where is Lauren now? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Last I heard, she was living somewhere in Florida, trying to start over. She's not doing well, honestly. The public exposure destroyed her reputation completely. She can't find decent work because every potential employer searches her name and finds the articles. She's essentially living with our aunt, dependent on family charity she used to look down on. Part of me, a small bitter part, felt satisfaction hearing that Lauren was facing real consequences for her actions. But mostly I just felt tired, weary of holding on to anger that no longer served any productive purpose. I hope she finds a way forward, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. I hope she learns from this and becomes someone better. That's more grace than she deserves, Amanda said quietly. More than any of us deserve, really. But thank you for that. After we hung up, I sat in the dimming evening light, reflecting on how much had changed in less than a year. How close I'd come to losing Thomas entirely, to watching him marry someone who would have spent years systematically destroying him from the inside out. But we'd survived it. More than survived. We'd emerged stronger, more connected, more honest with each other than we'd ever been before. The next morning, I pulled the memory album out from under my bed, the one I'd made for Thomas and Lauren, that had never been given, never been seen. I sat on my bedroom floor and slowly paged through it, looking at photographs documenting Thomas's entire life, each image representing a moment of love and sacrifice and determination. And then, carefully and deliberately, I began creating a new album. Not for Thomas's wedding this time, but simply as a record of our journey together. The difficult years after his father left, the celebration when he graduated high school, the pride when he completed medical school, the pain and healing that came after Lauren's betrayal. All of it deserved to be remembered and honored. Not just the happy moments, but the struggles too, because those struggles had shaped both of us into who we'd become. When Thomas came over for dinner that next Sunday, I showed him the new album, still incomplete, but already meaningful. He looked through it slowly, his expression moving through a range of emotions. Nostalgia, sadness, gratitude, love. "You never gave up on me," he said finally, closing the album gently. "Even when I was making terrible choices. Even when I couldn't see what was right in front of me, you never stopped fighting for me." "That's what real family does," I answered, taking his hand across the table. "Real family doesn't give up when things get difficult. Real family doesn't cut people out because they're inconvenient or because they don't fit into some perfect picture. Real family stays. Through everything. Always." He squeezed my hand tightly, and in that simple gesture, I felt everything that had been broken between us finally fully healed, finally complete. "I know that now, Mom," he whispered. "I finally understand what family actually means." And sitting there in my small kitchen, holding my son's hand while evening settled around us, I realized that despite everything we'd endured, despite all the pain and betrayal and public humiliation, we'd gained something invaluable. We'd learned that our bond, forged through decades of struggle and unconditional love, was stronger than any scheme designed to break it. That truth, when properly defended, will eventually overcome even the most elaborate deceptions. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is refusing to let them make a catastrophic mistake, even when defending them makes you the villain in someone else's story. Lauren had told me I wouldn't be part of Thomas's family anymore, had tried her absolute hardest to erase me from his future, but she'd failed completely. Because I wasn't just part of Thomas's family. I was his family, the foundation everything else was built upon, and no amount of manipulation or cruelty or calculated scheming could ever change that fundamental truth. As Thomas and I sat together that evening, planning our next Sunday dinner and discussing his developing relationship with Sarah and laughing about shared memories from his childhood, I felt profound gratitude for the path we'd walked together. It hadn't been easy. It had often been brutally difficult, actually, but it had been real, authentic, built on love that asked for nothing in return except the chance to continue loving. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the wedding that never happened, not the vindication of being proven right, not even the public recognition that I'd been protecting my son all along. What mattered was this: Sunday dinners and honest conversations and knowing with absolute certainty that we'd always have each other's backs, no matter what storms might come our way in the future. That's what it truly means to be family. Not genetics or legal contracts or social expectations, just showing up, again and again, through everything, always.